what the Hopi elders refused to say about the tunnels under the Grand Canyon until 1909. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a front-page story that should have changed everything. The headline said, "Explorations in Grand Canyon, Mysteries of Immense High Cavern Being Brought to Light." The byline gave credit to a Smithsonian-affiliated explorer named G.E. Consinkide. The article was detailed, specific, and checkable in the way serious journalism used to be. It gave coordinates. It named institutions. It described a discovery so important that, if the Smithsonian had followed up on it with the same urgency the article suggested, we would be talking about it in every history classroom in America. Instead, the Smithsonian said it never happened. The article, they claimed, was fiction. G.E. Consinkade, they suggested, may not have existed. The discovery, if one happened at all, left no institutional record. The Arizona Gazette ran the story anyway, and the Hopi elders, who had kept a certain silence about the canyon longer than any newspaper had existed, did not deny it. That silence is what this is about. Not the shocking parts of the 1909 article, though those parts are worth studying carefully. The silence is the subject. The specific, deliberate, multi-generational refusal of the Hopi people to talk about certain parts of what lies beneath the Grand Canyon, and what that silence tells us about a history the official record has consistently refused to investigate. Because the Hopi do not claim they know nothing about the canyon. They claim knowledge, very old knowledge. Part of that knowledge has always been seen as too important to share with people who would not understand its meaning or who would use it in ways the tradition considered dangerous. What changed in 1909 was not the knowledge. What changed was that a newspaper published a version of it, with its context removed, framed it as an archaeological sensation, and the silence that had protected it for generations suddenly had a very loud match in the public record. The question this video is asking is simple. What did the Hopi elders know? What were they protecting? And why does the economic history of the American Southwest between 1850 and 1920 explain, with uncomfortable precision, why that protection was necessary? The answer includes tunnels, but it also includes railroads, federal land seizures, the Smithsonian's institutional agenda in the late 19th century, and a pattern of historical control that should by now be familiar to anyone who has spent time looking at what the official record leaves out. Start with what the 1909 article actually said. Consinkade, described as a government surveyor funded by the Smithsonian, claimed to have found a huge underground complex on the north side of the Grand Canyon, about 42 miles up the Colorado River from El Tovar, the Santa Fe Railway Hotel, completed just 5 years earlier. The entrance was in a cliff face several hundred feet above the river, reachable only by rope. Inside, Consinkade described passages running in the 4 main directions, arranged with geometric precision. He described a main corridor stretching several hundred feet into the cliff, with chambers off the main passage containing artifacts, statues, and what he described as mummies wrapped in dark cloth. The statuary, according to Consinkade, was not of Native American origin in the usual sense. In his description, it was clearly Asian in character. The artifacts included copper items, tablets with hieroglyphic-style markings, and objects that Consinkade compared to Egyptian ceremonial tools. The mummies were found in seated positions in niches cut into the chamber walls. Consinkade estimated the complex was the work of a civilization with great organizational ability, pointing to the careful planning shown in the passage engineering, the sameness of the artifacts, and the depth of the complex, which reached far enough into the canyon wall that the inner chambers showed no signs of flooding. The Smithsonian, when contacted by journalists in the weeks that followed, said it had no record of a G.E. Consinkade and no record of any such expedition. The institutional denial was complete and permanent. Here is the first thing that should stand out about that denial. The Smithsonian in 1909 was not the open, publicly accountable institution it presents itself as today. It was a federally funded organization, working in a time when the federal government's relationship to indigenous land in the Southwest was driven by one main priority, which was acquisition. The Dawes Act of 1887 had already started the systematic breaking apart of tribal landholdings across the country. The Hopi themselves had been forced into the boarding school system, the suppression of ceremonial practices, and a steady federal campaign to replace traditional government with structures that fit American property law more easily. In that context, the discovery of a pre-Columbian complex of major cultural and possibly civilizational scale in the Grand Canyon was not just academically inconvenient, it was economically and legally threatening. If the complex existed, it established a continuity of occupation. I have to stop here for a second, because what I just described is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different kinds of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into one video. It is in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It was denied out of institutional self-preservation in a political environment where the other option, which was confirming the discovery, carried consequences that no federally funded institution in 1909 was ready to absorb. That is the revisionist economic history argument. Not that the Smithsonian is a secret society protecting forbidden knowledge. That it is a federal institution working within the limits of its funding relationships, and that in 1909 those limits pointed clearly toward denial. Now come at this from the other side. Come at it from the Hopi side. The Hopi people have lived on the Colorado Plateau, including lands next to the Grand Canyon, for at least 2,000 years. Their oral tradition goes back much further, and that tradition includes a specific and detailed account of the underworld, which the Hopi call the Sipapoo or Sipapoo, depending on dialect. The Sipapoo is not a metaphor in Hopi cosmology. It is a physical place, a real location in the landscape through which the Hopi ancestors came into the present world from the world below. That location is identified in Hopi tradition as being at the bottom of the Little Colorado River Gorge near where it meets the Colorado River, inside what we now call the Grand Canyon. The Hopi do not make careless claims about sacred sites. Their oral tradition has kept exact geographic detail through generations in which that exactness served no purpose except accuracy. When Hopi tradition identifies the Sipapoo as a physical place at the bottom of a canyon in a specific region, and when a 1909 newspaper article describes an underground complex with chambers and passages in that same general region, the overlap is not small. What the Hopi elders have consistently refused to discuss in public, in interviews, and in academic settings is the full extent of what lies beneath the canyon. They talk about the Sipapoo and the emergence tradition. What they do not discuss, and what several researchers who spent years in Hopi communities have said they were directly told not to ask about, are the passages. The horizontal passages, not the vertical emergence point, but the network of underground routes that the tradition describes as connecting the Sipapoo to other sacred sites across a landscape that, in the Hopi worldview, is not a wilderness, but a maintained, mapped, and intentionally structured territory. That difference matters enormously. The vertical emergence point is the public cosmology. The horizontal network is the private record. And that record, according to fragments that have reached public discussion through trusted researchers, describes a precont. Infrastructure of considerable scale. The reason it was kept private was not superstition. It was strategy. By the time the Santa Fe Railway reached the south rim of the Grand Canyon in 1901, the economic change of the region was already happening. The railway brought tourists. The tourists brought money. The money brought federal attention that focused, with the relentless logic of American frontier capitalism, on turning the landscape into a commodity. Theodore Roosevelt visited in 1903 and said it was too magnificent to alter. In 1908, he made it a national monument. In 1919, it became a national park. Each of those designations, framed in the language of preservation, had a structural effect on indigenous access to and claim over the territory. A national monument is federal land managed by federal agencies. Federal agencies in 1908 and 1919 were not managed for the benefit of the Hopi or any other indigenous nation with historical ties to the canyon. The Havasupai people, who had lived within the canyon for centuries, were not consulted during the monument designation. They were steadily restricted from land they had occupied without interruption. The economic logic was simple. Tourism required the canyon to look unoccupied. An unoccupied canyon was pristine wilderness. Pristine wilderness was a national treasure belonging to all Americans, which in practice meant the economic interests shaping federal policy. In that context, a 1909 article describing a pre-Conti underground complex of possible civilizational importance represented a specific kind of threat, not to the tourists, but to the legal structure that made the tourist economy possible. Because if the canyon contained evidence of continuous, sophisticated, organized occupation going back further than the arrival of any European power, then the land designations of 1908 and 1919 were not acts of preservation, they were acts of appropriation. The Hopi elders understood this. They had watched boarding schools take their children. They had watched the government suppress the ceremonies that kept their relationship to the land alive. They had watched the railway bring 100,000 tourists a year to stand at the rim of a canyon that their tradition described as the entry point to the world their ancestors came from. They understood exactly what it would mean to confirm publicly in 1909 that the canyon held evidence of a civilization older and more complex than the official history of the American Southwest admitted. It would mean nothing useful. The machinery was already moving. The economic interests were already rooted in place. The legal structures were already set. A confirmation would not have changed the outcome for the Hopi. It would have sped up the extraction of whatever was down there by people who would not have known or cared about its meaning. So they said nothing, and the silence, held for generations, kept something whole that a public disclosure in 1909 would have destroyed. This is the structure of the argument, but the structure needs evidence. The geographic record is the first place to look. The Grand Canyon is about 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and more than a mile deep. It was made a national monument in 1908 and a national park in 1919. In that whole territory, less than 10% has been archaeologically surveyed in any systematic way. The surveys that have been done focused with institutional consistency on the rim and the areas near established trails that were easiest to reach. The deep interior of the canyon, the parts reachable only by long river travel or technical climbing, have been surveyed only now and then, if at all. In the areas that have been surveyed, archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation going back at least 4,000 years. They have found granaries, pictographs, and petroglyphs in places that take real effort to reach. They have found storage structures and settlement sites representing at least 3 different cultural traditions. They have found evidence of agricultural terracing on canyon walls at heights where no current model of pre-Cont canyon occupation would expect farming. In other words, every time someone looks closely at the Grand Canyon, they find more evidence of human presence than the last investigation predicted. The pattern is consistent across the whole history of archaeological work in the region. Every survey expands the known timeline of occupation and the known geographic range of pre-Cont activity. The assumption about what the canyon contained has not changed, even while the evidence has consistently challenged it. The documentary record is just as instructive. The 1909 Arizona Gazette article has been studied closely, and that study has produced a result that should be stated carefully and accurately. Researchers have not been able to confirm the article's claims. They also have not been able to confirm the Smithsonian's denial in a way that settles the issue. The Smithsonian's personnel records for the relevant period have gaps. The institutional archives contain sections that have not been made available for independent review. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment matters. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. Which is to say, selectively, with an eye toward what disclosures serve institutional interests and what disclosures do not. The economic record makes the pattern visible. Between 1900 and 1930, the Grand Canyon region became one of the most heavily developed tourist destinations in the American West. The Santa Fe Railway invested heavily in the South Rim's infrastructure. The Fred Harvey Company built hotels, restaurants, and curio shops, selling indigenous art objects at prices set by the company, not by the people who made them. The whole economic system of Grand Canyon tourism was built on a specific story about the canyon, one in which it was a natural wonder, pristine and ancient, once inhabited by simple peoples who had left only modest traces. That story was economically necessary. Tourists do not pay to visit places of ongoing indigenous occupation and contested land rights. They pay to visit a wonder of nature, a place of ancient mystery belonging to all humanity, which in practice meant the companies that held the concessions. The suppression of evidence that did not fit that story was not an academic decision, it was an economic one. Institutions dependent on federal concessions, including the Smithsonian, which operated museums tied to the federal tourism system, had direct financial reasons to keep the story that the canyon was a natural wonder with only modest, properly documented human history. Evidence of a large pre-Kant underground complex would not fit that story legally, economically, or politically. The forces pushing toward denial were not conspiratorial. They were structural. Structure creates outcomes more reliably than conspiracy, because it only requires institutions to act in their own interests, which they reliably do. The ethnographic record is the most carefully guarded. Multiple researchers working independently over the past 50 years have documented accounts from Hopi community members describing underground routes in the canyon region. These accounts are not identical and not systematically organized, which is itself important. If the accounts had been made up for outsiders, they would be more consistent. Instead, they show the kind of variation that marks accounts of something real passed down through generations without central control. The accounts describe passages connecting the Sipapoo to other sacred places across a geographic range covering parts of Arizona, Utah, and possibly Nevada. They describe the passages as built or as natural formations changed and marked over long periods. They describe the passages as holding objects of ceremonial importance placed there by the ancestors, specifically so they would be preserved through whatever disruption might come. That last element is the detail the ethnographic record handles most carefully and most consistently. Hopi tradition does not describe the underground complex as something hidden because Europeans arrived. It describes it as something chosen for concealment, long before European arrival, as part of a practice of keeping continuity through the kind of civilizational disruption that the tradition seems to have expected would happen again. Placing important objects in hard-to-reach places to protect them during times of social disruption is documented across several cultural traditions in the Southwest. The Hopi version stands out because of its geographic precision and because of how consistently the tradition has kept the rule against public disclosure. You do not keep a prohibition for centuries without a reason. The reason given by Hopi scholars in academic settings is that disclosure, without the full context of the tradition that created the sites, would not protect them. It would expose them in a landscape defined for a century and a half by the economic logic of extraction. Exposure is destruction. The Hopi elders who refused to talk about the tunnels in the years before and after 1909 were not protecting a secret just for the sake of secrecy. They were protecting an archive, a physical record placed in the most unreachable terrain in North America, kept safe by a tradition of silence that had, for centuries, successfully preserved it. The 1909 article cracked that silence from the outside. It named the rough location. It described the architectural features in enough detail to suggest how large the thing below was. It put the story into the public record in a form that, if the Smithsonian had confirmed it instead of denying it, would have sent dozens of expeditions into that canyon within 5 years. The Smithsonian's denial, whatever its reason, functioned as protection. Unintentional protection, most likely, but protection all the same. The denial made the story look like a hoax, and the hoax label stuck to anyone who took the article seriously. The canyon kept its secrets for another century. What the economic history adds to this picture is a dimension neither the believers nor the debunkers usually admit. The period between 1890 and 1920 was not a time of neutral historical inquiry. It was a time of active, legally formalized dispossession of indigenous land across the American West. The institutional tools of that dispossession included not only land law, but also the control of historical knowledge, because historical knowledge remains one of the few legal foundations on which indigenous land claims can be made. The Smithsonian knew this. The Bureau of Indian Affairs knew this. The railway companies and concession operators who built businesses on federal land in the Grand Canyon knew this. The economic reason to minimize the depth and complexity of pre-cont. Civilization in the region was not vague. It could be counted in land values, concession fees, and the stability of federal land grants. In that incentive structure, the discovery of a complex pre-Kon-Titi underground site in the Grand Canyon represented a specific liability, managed the way institutions usually manage liabilities, through denial, silence, and redirection toward a more comfortable version of the evidence. The Hopi elders, watching this process from the inside, already knew what the outcome would be. They had lived through the Dawes Act. They had watched their children taken to distant boarding schools. They had seen what happened when indigenous knowledge entered the public domain without the protection of the tradition that gave it meaning. Confirmation of what lay beneath the canyon would not protect those sites. It would lead to their excavation by people who would classify them as American heritage instead of Hopi heritage, completing the same logic already used on the land above. So the silence continued, and here is what the silence has preserved. The Grand Canyon today contains, by conservative archaeological estimate, more than 4,000 documented archaeological sites. The surveys have been systematic in some places and completely missing in others. The river corridor, the deep canyon walls, and the sections reachable only by technical means remain mostly unsurveyed. The National Park Service's own inventories admit that the current site count is only part of the picture, and that continued survey work keeps revealing new sites in areas once thought to be already examined. What has not happened in the entire history of Grand Canyon archaeology is a systematic investigation of the deep cliff formations in the areas described in the 1909 article. The region can be reached with the right permits and equipment. It has not been archaeologically investigated in a formal, publicly documented way. That absence is not accidental. The permit system that controls archaeological work in the canyon operates through the National Park Service under federal mandate, reflecting the economic and political priorities of the federal government and the interests shaping its policy. In the current environment, those interests include a tourism economy worth several $100 million each year, legal relationships with the Hopi and other tribal nations that any major discovery would instantly complicate, and an institutional investment in the current story of canyon prehistory that goes back more than a century. The silence has different architects now than it did in 1909, but the structure is the same. The canyon wall does not care about the economics of national park concessions. The passages, if they exist, as both Hopi tradition and the 1909 article suggest, are still there. The objects placed by the ancestors of the Hopi, specifically to survive the disruption their tradition said was coming, are still in the dark inside of a deep desert cliff, waiting for the context in which they can be brought forward without being turned into someone else's heritage. The Hopi elders who refused to speak in 1909 made a calculation. They decided that preserving the archive was worth the cost of letting the outsider story, the hoax label, and the dismissal stand without contradiction. They decided that a truth admitted without its context is not a truth. It is a commodity. They were completely right. The evidence for what lies beneath the Grand Canyon is incomplete and disputed. The 1909 article is unverified, and its author is still disputed. The Smithsonian's denial is unresolved. The ethnographic accounts are fragmentary and privately held. The archaeological record is systematically incomplete in exactly the places where the evidence would matter most. This is the pattern, not proof, the pattern. When you find a pattern of incompleteness in a record that gathers around one specific kind of evidence, the question to ask is not whether the evidence is real. The question to ask is who benefits from the incompleteness and whether the people who benefit had the means and the reason to keep it that way. The economic history of the American Southwest between 1850 and 1920 answers that question clearly. The beneficiaries were the landholding interests, the railway companies, and the institutional structures that turned indigenous territory into American heritage. They had every means and every reason to make sure the record stayed incomplete, and it has stayed incomplete with a consistency greater than what random loss of documentation would produce. The canyon is still there. And the silence of the elders is still there too, though younger Hopi scholars are beginning to address these questions in ways that do not require the same total protection their predecessors kept. The legal and political landscape has shifted slowly, and only partly in ways that offer, at least, the possibility that knowledge brought forward now might come on terms the tradition can accept. That is not a small thing. It is the result of more than a century of strategic silence, kept at real cost by people who understood that what they were protecting was not only their own heritage, but a record. The rest of us lost the ability to read when we cleared the old growth, put away the maps, and told ourselves we were the beginning of something instead of the continuation of something much older. The canyon still holds the record. The question is whether we will find a way to read it before the economics of the national park system, the demands of the tourism industry, and 100 years of institutional investment in one specific story finish the job the 1909 denial began. Some questions are worth sitting with longer than the news cycle allows. This one has been sitting for more than 115 years. The passages in the cliff face along the north wall of the Grand Canyon in the remote stretch 42 miles up the Colorado from El Tovar have not been formally surveyed. The cliff face is still there, reachable by anyone with the right permits, enough rope and enough patience to look at what a 1909 reporter thought was worth putting on the front page of a newspaper while the canyon was being turned into a federal asset. The Hopi knew what was there. They knew long before King's article. They knew because the knowledge was given to them specifically so that someone would still know when the time came that knowing mattered. That time may be closer than the institutions managing the record would prefer. If you found this worth your time, share it with someone who asks the right questions. The research that challenges comfortable stories does not move through official channels. It moves through people who notice what is missing and decide the missing parts matter. Stay curious, stay skeptical, stay informed.